In this video, I want to talk about one of the most successful revolutions in the world, a nation with a rich culture, strong infrastructure, a relatively good economy, and a decent standard of living. What happened that allowed Georgia to make such rapid progress in such a short time? In 1991, when Georgia declared independence from the Soviet Union, the Republic of Georgia was officially established. That same year, the provisional government held elections and Georgia's first president was elected. However, just a few months later, a military coup overthrew the president, and power fell into the hands of the Speaker of the Georgian Parliament, a man named Eduard Shevardnadze. Shevardnadze initially served as the head of government for 4 years. Afterward, he formally became Georgia's second president through elections. Following independence, Georgia faced dire circumstances. Parts of the country, supported by Russia, declared autonomy. The economy was in bad shape, inflation was rampant, and the population was struggling. Although Shevardnadze managed to curb inflation to some extent in the early years and took steps to improve the country's infrastructure, over time, systemic corruption in his administration made conditions even worse for the people. This erosion of trust caused Shevardnadze to lose popular support. Despite this, in 2000, Shevardnadze ran for re-election and won again. Many people at the time believed he had rigged the election. During his second term, the situation worsened further, leading many political elites to lose faith in the ruling party and form their own political groups. One notable figure was Mikhail Saakashvili, the country's Minister of Justice, who resigned and formed his own party, the United National Movement. This party eventually became the main opposition party against the government. As time passed, more members of the ruling party defected and joined rival parties. The situation deteriorated to the point where Shevardnadze's approval rating dropped below 5%, leaving him with almost no support. In addition to the opposition party, numerous NGOs and civil society organizations emerged, advocating for human rights and the freedom of information. Meanwhile, the International Monetary Fund, IMF, cut off its assistance to Georgia, further worsening the country's economic situation. At one point, the government owed $120 million in unpaid wages. Public infrastructure and energy services were in shambles, to the extent that government offices had to close on some days of the year. Half of Georgia's population fell below the poverty line, and corruption among officials and police reached its peak. Georgia became one of the most corrupt nations in the world in terms of governance. It was widely believed that incomes were so low that many people resorted to corruption to survive. For example, government ministers earned such meager salaries that they had to rely on bribes to make ends meet. The widespread poverty and corruption pushed the country to the brink of collapse. Incomes were low, corruption was rampant, and people had no hope in the electoral process, knowing that fraud would occur. At this point, a major grassroots movement called Camara, inspired by the civil resistance movement from Serbia's revolution, gained momentum. Camara's symbol, like the Serbian movement, was a clenched fist. Initially, members of Camara started protesting corruption in universities. Later, they launched street campaigns, distributing posters and flyers with the slogan Camara, which means enough. They used humor and satire in the media to highlight the hardships caused by the government, aiming to re-engage a disillusioned public that had lost interest in politics. On their own radio and TV platforms, they issued calls to action, while Rustavi 2, an independent TV channel, aired news exposing corruption, discussing the poor economy, and sharing statements from the opposition and Camara. They even broadcast documentaries about other revolutions, such as the Serbian Revolution, to inspire and motivate people. Kamara's members knew that the only way to remove Shevardnadze was to dismantle his party, and the 2003 parliamentary elections were their best opportunity. In response, students and citizens launched a campaign called Vote Them Out. Opposition parties also organized similar campaigns and called for independent oversight of the elections to prevent fraud. The parliamentary elections were held on November 2, 2003. To ensure fairness, independent organizations conducted separate polling alongside official government agencies. Despite these efforts, the government announced its own results, declaring Shevardnadze's Citizens Union Party the winner. Independent polls, however, indicated otherwise, showing that the National Movement Party, led by Mikhail Saakashvili, had actually won. This led opposition parties to unite, urging people to join protests and civil disobedience to demand new elections. In mid-November, large demonstrations began in Tbilisi's central streets and quickly spread to other cities. Their unified slogan was Kamara, meaning enough. Protesters gathered outside Parliament. Despite the cold winter weather, they persisted, staying on the streets with hats, umbrellas, and whatever they could to endure the conditions. Nearby shopkeepers and residents brought food to the protesters. The people weren't afraid of the military forces, believing that soldiers had endured the same hardships under Shevardnadze's rule. They felt the military wouldn't open fire on citizens sharing their struggles, and they were right. The soldiers didn't shoot. The sheer number of protesters also discouraged the military from taking any action against them. The protests peaked on November 22, 2003, when Shevardnadze tried to open the session of the new parliament. Protesters, led by Saakashvili, entered the parliament building holding roses, interrupted Shevardnadze's speech, and chanted, "Resign, resign." This act gave the movement its name, the Rose Revolution. Realizing the dire situation, Shevardnadze fled with his security guards. He later declared a state of emergency and mobilized police around his residence. The following day, Shevardnadze met with Saakashvili and other opposition leaders and officially announced his resignation. When the news spread, about 50,000 protesters in the streets celebrated. After Shevardnadze's resignation, the previous parliamentary speaker assumed the role of interim president until new elections could be held. The Georgian courts annulled the results of the prior elections, and 6 weeks later, a new presidential election was held. Mikhail Saakashvili won with over 96% of the vote, becoming Europe's youngest president at age 36. In a short time, Saakashvili managed to improve Georgia's economy. Within a year, he paid all outstanding salaries for government employees and teachers. In the following years, the country's treasury grew fivefold under his leadership. Saakashvili also improved Georgia's global standing. Under his leadership, the country's World Bank ranking rose from 122nd to 18th place. He effectively tackled corruption and introduced transparency by making all police department buildings glass-fronted, symbolizing that all activities inside could be easily observed by the public. Today, Georgia is considered one of the most advanced countries in its region. However, during his second term, Saakashvili's popularity declined, and he eventually lost the presidential election to his opponent. This peaceful transfer of power demonstrated the fairness of Georgia's elections and the lack of government interference in the results. Saakashvili's departure itself symbolized the freedom Georgian citizens had gained. This was the story of the Rose Revolution. But Georgia experienced another significant revolution, often called the Second Rose Revolution. In the Ajara region, which had declared autonomy before the Rose Revolution, a man named Aslan Abashidze was in power. After witnessing the revolution in Georgia, the people of Ajara also wanted to rejoin the country. However, Abashidze resisted. In 2004, thousands of people in Ajara rose against the militarization and separatism imposed by Abashidze's government. Unlike the Rose Revolution this time, the government responded with violent crackdowns using military forces. Abashidze's heavy-handed tactics only fueled the protests further. The following day, even more people gathered in the streets, refusing to back down. Meanwhile, Georgian special forces were deployed along the borders of Ajara. This mounting pressure forced Abashidze to resign and flee to Russia. The day after his resignation, Saakashvili visited Batumi amidst public cheers, officially reintegrating Ajara into Georgia. The Rose Revolution was initially inspired by Serbia's revolution, but later became a source of inspiration for other movements, including Ukraine's Orange Revolution and similar uprisings elsewhere. The people of Georgia did not remain indifferent. They stood their ground and fought for their rights, ultimately achieving what they deserved: